Hi everyone. You're listening to the Southasia Review of Books podcast from Himal Southasian, where we speak to celebrated authors and emerging literary voices from across South Asia. I'm your host, Shwetha Srikanthan, Associate Editor at Himal Southasian, coming to you from Colombo. My guest today is the renowned Pakistani-British activist, writer, journalist, and public intellectual, Tariq Ali, joining us from London to talk about his new memoir, You Can't Please All. Before we get started, I'd like to take a moment to invite our listeners to check out Himal's Patreon program, where you can pay to support our mission to give South Asian literature the spotlight it deserves. To make conversations like this possible, we need the support of our listeners like you. In his new memoir, spanning the 1980s to the present, Tariq Ali reflects on the onset of neoliberalism in the West and turmoil in South Asia, and fiercely critiques the war on terror and the crimes of Israel. With anecdotes and reflections, Tariq gives us glimpses of the fascinating company of friends and comrades he kept. From Edward Said, Satyajit Ray, Hugo Chávez, Benazir Bhutto, as well as the moving accounts of his family, how they lived during the early years of Pakistan. He recounts a life committed to socialist and anti-imperialist activism, writing, and cultural intervention that ushered in a new era of dissent. Tariq, welcome to the Southasia Review of Books podcast, and thank you so much for joining us to talk about your extraordinary memoir.
Thank you very much for inviting me. I'm amazed you managed to get through this big book, but I'm delighted.
Let's start where the memoir ends. You completed this book against the backdrop of the unrelenting war waged by Israel against Palestine. Gaza is still being bombed and its people are massacred by a state that has powerful supporters. Ever since the Six-Day War of 1967 and the occupation that followed, you have been a supporter of the Palestinian resistance. Today, the genocide has opened more eyes, as has the shameful support for Israel by the West. The untruths fed by Israel via Western propaganda networks are not having the impact they once had, and are being challenged by huge demonstrations. What are your thoughts on the progression of the resistance movement and activism for Palestine today?
Well, the Israelis have tried very hard to wipe out Hamas completely. They've not succeeded so far. They've killed its leaders, but they've been doing that for a long, long time. They haven't succeeded in destroying the organization. The official organization they recognize, the Palestinian Authority, so-called, is effectively a collaborators organization. The Israelis and the Americans and the EU give them a lot of money to pay salaries to everyone to try and keep people happy. But this cannot last too long because the collaborationist leadership is under pressure in the West Bank, where the settlements continue to grow and grow, backed by the government, officially backed by the government, and backed by the United States of America. Look, when you talk about Israel, it's a bit foolish to talk about Israel alone. Without the support, military, political, ideological, of the United States, this war could not be taking place. And it has now become part of the war, not just of Israel against Palestine, that has been going on for a long time. This is also a war to establish as permanently as they can American hegemony in the Middle East. That is what's going on a national, regional, and global scale. With the extension of the war to Lebanon, the Israelis and the Americans, and these are American leaders led by Joe Biden. Trump hasn't yet come to power. This is the Democrats who have waged more wars, believe it or not, than the Republicans. And so it's an appalling situation. And I'm always a bit shocked that in all these demonstrations, great though they are, the central target, for obvious reasons, is Israel. But it should be the United States of America and its so-called satellite puppet states led by Britain in Europe who are backing this war to the hilt. I mean, we have a newly elected Labour government here in Britain. No difference whatsoever on most questions with their Conservative predecessors. So we're living in a world where democracy in any meaningful sense is being hollowed out. The state and its agencies do not want to permit the election of a government which challenges the status quo in even the smallest way. And even as we speak, there is turmoil in South Korea, where the elected president of South Korea attempted to organize a coup d'etat. This is it's a pro-US state. It's a satellite state of the United States. The United Nations doesn't matter at all, except the Security Council, where they can exercise their veto. So what this most recent war on Palestine has shown is that totally exposed the double standards of the West. They can do anything, but their so-called enemies aren't allowed to do anything. So it's shocking, not particularly to me, but shocking to a whole new generation who have grown up believing that there was something called human rights, etc., and find that there's nothing. I mean, this live stream genocide is one of the most appalling things I've witnessed in my life, and I was in North Vietnam during the American war in that country, and it is appalling, the ruthless slaughter of citizens, of women, of children, and that is what is being called genocide, this attempt. Amnesty International called it that today, genocide. So this attempt to wipe out the Palestinians politically having failed, they clearly, it seems, now intent on doing it physically. Go, get out, and we leave you alone. Go and live in the Arab countries. This is our country. This is not your country. The language they use, most of this cabinet, is reminiscent of the Third Reich and the Nazis. They don't care if you say it to them. This is so what? We've learned our lessons. We're not going to let that happen again. But, you're doing it to other people. So I've always argued for a long, long time now that the Palestinians are the indirect victims of the Judeo-side of the Second World War. That's now obvious. They're being punished for the crimes of others, if for that at all. I mean, on one level, it's a straightforward colonial operation backed by the West.
You were in your 40s when you wrote the first volume of your memoirs, Street Fighting Years. In that volume, you avoided saying too much about yourself and instead sketched a series of encounters and engagements that have marked your life as an activist and mostly concentrated on the 60s revolutions. In the decades that followed, your struggle continued but in different forms. Tell us about the last 40 years of your intellectual life and how the new memoir differs from the last.
The last memoir, Street Fighting Years, had a subtitle, An Autobiography of the 60s. And that's what it was. This book is actually a book about many things, about political ups and downs, of living in a period of the total victory of capital on a global scale, of the decline of socialism on a huge scale, the destruction, the implosion of the Soviet Union, the Chinese road to capitalism, very successful. And I would remark that China didn't need any democracy to make capitalism. So this notion that capitalism and democracy are interlinked, which was always foolish, has now been completely exploded by Chinese advances and Chinese economic development. This has been done by a one-party state, and that party is also the party that made the revolution. Of course, it's very changed, but it is still there. So these things are now having an impact on the world. My own life has been dominated by politics always, but I stepped sideways in the late 80s and 90s. I wrote a set of novels known as the Islam Quintet, highlighting the clash between Islamic civilization and Western Christendom. And these books, it was a long project. They took me 25 years to do. I didn't stop doing other things, but it was a long project which finally came to an end in this century. I did a lot of documentary work for my company, Bandung Productions Limited, which, we made the Bandung File for Channel 4 television, which covered South Asia regularly. It was the best coverage of South Asia in anywhere, I would say, because we didn't just cover one country, we covered the whole subcontinent and other parts of Asia as well. And my colleague Darkus Hau concentrated on the Caribbean islands and Africa. So we created a pretty unique program of which I'm very proud, and then went on from there to create Rear Window, an intellectual cultural program, which also had a big impact. And so I'm very proud of that work. It wasn't your normal commercial television, exactly the opposite. And sometimes when I show these documentaries to students, they say, was this actually on British television? They cannot believe it. And I say it was, and what was once can happen again. So don't give up too easily. Times may change. And so then with 9/11 at the beginning of this century, my life shifted again to a very direct involvement in politics. I stopped writing fiction. I carried on writing plays for the theatre, but I began also to write now, once again, non-fiction books, of which The Clash of Fundamentalisms was the one that traveled all over the world. And then books on the war in Iraq, books on Obama, basically making into books what we could no longer write in the media, as the media tightened up. I, been involved with the New Left Review for many years, and I remember once coming to Sri Lanka to interview Vijayvera, the leader of the JVP, Rohan Vijayvera, and we published his interview, and the next time I met him, he said, "Comrade, you did a lot of creative editing to my interview. You made it into very brilliant. It's very good now." I said, "It's our job to do that." And we had a very good talk. I remember sitting on the gardens in Colombo, not far from the university, discussing all those early experiences and what happened and what went wrong. And I had, Bala Tampo, the leader of the Ceylon Mercantile Union, was an old comrade and friend, a Tamil who defended every section of the working class, Sinhala and Tamil. And then I was very sad to see what happened in the clashes between the majority community and the minority community, and the inevitable slide into chaos and civil war. And we had such other hopes for Sri Lanka as for India, Pakistan. I haven't written about Sri Lanka because the book was already too long, but I have written a bit about India, my meetings with Mrs. Gandhi, and Pakistan, which I know well, and on which I've written 3 books myself over the years. So, I'm basically a political animal, have always remained that, and my claws are still there. I haven't basically, obviously, the world is different, so you can't sort of speak the same language in the 60s and 70s, but the enemies are still there. Capital and empire, they're still there and have to be opposed. So that's what I've been doing, and carry on doing. And the last novel explains and reflects on all these activities. What is new in the book is that I've written about my family, which I had not written before, but there were too many requests to do so and not to resist. At one point, my editor said maybe we should publish this as a separate little book. And I said, no, it's all part of the same business. Put it in. And so, the world changes, one's life changes, but the problems are even worse than they used to be in the 60s and 70s. I mean, this pernicious, brutal form of capital that has been imposed on the world is very destructive. It's true that in countries like China, where it is still under some degree of state control, they have made huge advances. There's no denying that. And these advances have made China into the industrial base of the world almost. The world market has moved eastwards and it's settled in China for the time being. And this, for the United States, is a challenge. If China just did economics, they'd be happy. But China does politics too. And Chinese foreign policy often resists now what the West is doing. They didn't talk about foreign policy for many years. I used to joke we should hire detectives to go and search out where is Chinese foreign policy. We no longer need to do that. They've come out openly. They're effectively critical of American hegemonism. And let's hope it stays that way. And let's hope that no crazy element within the American administration wants to make war on China or wreck that part of the world. They wrecked Europe by destroying Yugoslavia. They wrecked the Middle East by collaborating with the worst jihadi fundamentalists to hit and bring down regimes they didn't like. They've been backing Israel in this genocidal war against the Palestinians. They've been defending monarchical rule in Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states because it suits them. If it didn't, they'd jump it. They've kept a strict watch on the Egyptian army, which they pay to keep quiet, and the generals are busy making money so that they can retire with mansions and shops and God knows what. So capitalism and capital in this period is totally imbricated with empire. There's no separation. And, what else can I say? I mean, we fight on.
Fascinating to hear about your time in Sri Lanka with Vijay Veera. Thank you for sharing that, Tariq. So, one day in 1998, you met a stranger while jogging in Hampstead Heath who mentioned you changed his wife's life and career. His wife used to work at GCHQ, the secret spy headquarters used by UK intelligence agencies. Hearing your phone conversations where you read bedtime stories to your young daughter made her resign and step away. Again, in 2004, an elderly man who was your postman in Soho asked if you knew why your mail was late. It was being opened and read by the state. Your generation of activists and journalists were aware that you had been spied on in some way or another. That this was happening in Britain also didn't surprise you as much as it should have. Tell us about what it was like to be spied on for 50 years and to be aware of the fact.
What was it like? It was like normal. I wasn't particularly surprised. We were not planning terrorist attacks or violence against the state. So virtually everything we said in private, on political things, we said in private. I said in public, I wrote in public, so there was no big mystery about what my politics were. And the preliminary judgment of the Commission of Inquiry into all this is that this should have stopped a long time ago. And it should have stopped at the end of 1968. And it carried on and on, because once you set up these networks, it's quite useful to get even private information to use for purposes of blackmail or whatever. So they just carry on. No one stops them. It's out of control. And so they've been reprimanded, which confirms us in our views of that period and what we were doing. So no, I don't sort of go on about it. We knew. And it didn't bother us. It didn't, make us think, oh God, there's a spy somewhere. Stop talking what you're talking about. Stop saying anything. Why? And nowadays with surveillance, just use, the networks are used. Everything is used. Everyone is under surveillance. And once upon a time, people were made to think that it was only the East German Stasi that carried out this sort of activity. We were pure. Then it emerged that the Americans were spying on the German leadership. Edward Snowden exposed that. And the German political chancellor at the time, Angela Merkel, was shocked. Why was she shocked? Why are they so naive? Once you give these powers to your secret agencies, why shouldn't they spy on you? They spy on everyone. And in this case, obviously, they were sending information back to the CIA, the mother agency, based in Langley, Virginia. So, I have to admit, I wasn't surprised, and I was surprised that these politicians were surprised.
You were interested in the world and enraged by various social injustices from a very young age. When you were just 15 or 16, you organized a public demonstration in Lahore against the wrongful death sentencing of a young black man in the US, and later held other demonstrations in open defiance of the martial law regulations at the time. You were a part of a handful of activists in Pakistan who were politically ahead of the left in Western democracies and, for that matter, even across South Asia. Tell us about your early activism.
I used to read a lot. Even when I was at school, I read the newspapers. I read the magazines that came into our house from all over the world, especially left magazines from Britain and the United States, then English language magazines from China, the Soviet Union. And some of my friends found them boring and would say, oh, why are you wasting your time? Let's go do this and do that, which I also did, I don't deny. But I read a great deal. And that kept me interested in, I was just curious about the world. What is happening in Africa? We thought freedom was approaching. The British were withdrawing. Why is Lumumba being killed? Why? That was a very strong feeling in me. And so we discussed it and marched, defying martial law and chanting Lumumba will live, which he has done. No one forgets his name now. The first martyr of the African continent, killed after independence by the United States of America. So it came naturally to me. I can't say anything. It's not that I have any special powers or anything, like growing up. Anything else, like anyone else, obsessed with cricket, Western music, rock and roll, as well as our own poetry and the role played by poetry in aiding dissent. All these things were mixed up so that when it was time to do something, one did it. At that young age, you don't care. I mean, you never think you could be shot dead. as two students were in front of me when I was about 17 or 18 on the streets in Lahore. You don't think about that. And then you say, oh, well, if they've been shot dead, why am I any better for them? You carry.
I have to say, the section on your family, your parents' forbidden love story, the epic cinematic elopement was one of my favorite parts of the memoir. There are fascinating anecdotes. Your mother was expelled from the elite Queen Mary College of Lahore for insisting that Nehru, a nationalist leader at the time, be invited to address the college. While at school, she had actually corresponded with Nehru, who was then in prison. He had explained Indian history to her and told her what a good thing it was that she was being radicalized. Your father became a communist while at university in the 30s and was active in the Indian Students' Federation that had united the Indian left. His college days were dominated by the anti-imperialist struggle. He was also blacklisted by the country's first dictator, imprisoned briefly on 2 occasions by the third. Tell us about the impact your family has had on you, especially in the realm of radical politics.
Well, it had a huge impact on me. I would have been a different person had I been born into a different segment of our larger family. But I was very lucky. I had a happy childhood. I had parents who could be as strict and as tough as, any pair of parents, but who were also very kind. Never grudged me reading books. Couldn't understand some things, like I think the only time, or one of the 2 times, my father ever hit me, and that too quite gently, was when I was caught stealing books as a schoolboy in a very famous bookshop in Lahore. Who didn't ring the police? They knew who I was. I wish they had, but instead they rang my father, and he went home and was waiting for me and was very angry and said, "Have we ever denied you money for books?" I said, that is not the issue here. The issue is whether you can do it. So he slapped my face and said, yeah, every time you do it, this will be the result. I took it. But I cursed them, and the next time I went into that bookshop, I deliberately lift up my shirt, say, no books, as I was leaving. And I said to them, your bastards, why did you attack my father? You could have bought me, had the books back, I would even have paid for them. But no, I said, like good, goody people, you had to ring my parents. They never forgot me, and I never forgot them. It's a bookstore called the Punjab Religious Book Society on the Mall in Lahore. Very large bookshop, and of course they had old books. It started off as a religious bookshop. So, but as I've described often, our house was full of 2 types of people. One was family people, upper class feudals, most of them perfectly nice and friendly. But they included, senior police chiefs and army officers and civil servants. And on the other side, poets, singers, musicians, trade union leaders, peasant leaders, who were very exciting to be around because they spoke a different language. The same language, but very different priorities. And so I grew up with them, and including some of our most famous poets like Faz Ahmed Faz. That's what had this impact on me. I grew up with an abiding love of poetry, all poetry in every language, and still am. I mean, the Arab poets who've been writing about Palestine and their own Arab worlds and their leaders for the last God knows how many years. I admire greatly. And so, yeah, that's great. It wouldn't have happened had I grown up in a different type of household, whatever sort. And this was very particular and peculiar because of my parents, both of whom were radicals.
In 1979, the Pakistan Army 2 years after they toppled Zulfikar Ali Bhutto's government, decided to hang him. It was these events that compelled you to write your second book on Pakistan in 1982, Can Pakistan Survive? It came as a warning to the leaders that if they carry on like before, what's left of Pakistan might collapse. The title of the book created a storm, and the book was also banned in the country. When the military dictator Zia-ul Haq was visiting India and was asked by 2 journalists, Can Pakistan survive? Zia denounced you and the book. But Pakistan today is still facing several critical challenges: political, constitutional, economic, and geopolitical. What is your answer to the same question today? Can Pakistan survive its many enduring crises?
Yeah, that was a question I posed after the breakup of Pakistan and the formation of Bangladesh. And had events not taken a different turn in Iran and Afghanistan, I think Pakistan would have been threatened. My book was essentially an alarm call for the country. Watch it, because if you carry on like you did in Bangladesh, you'll go down. And in this same biography, I talk about my conversation with Indira Gandhi earlier on in the book, in which she wants me to say that Pakistan is preparing an attack on India. And I say, however much I might dislike the generals and disagree with them, I will not say this because it's not true. The generals would have to be mad. And then we discuss generals and their irrationality. And she tells me that some of the army, including the High Command, were in favor of taking West Pakistan too. So my question, can Pakistan survive, was not as misjudged as some people thought it was. But that was then. Today, I think Pakistan will survive. I mean, many countries, smaller in size, survive. And most importantly, Pakistan has nuclear weapons. No country with nuclear weapons is likely to go down because they'll use them in order to survive. The Israelis would too, by the way. They've got nuclear weapons. So that the survival of the country as a state is not in question anymore and hasn't been for many years, despite the atrocities committed in Balochistan and Pakhtunkhwa and the Punjab from time to time. But it's not in a good state. But then which state in South Asia is in a good state? You just go down the list. India, taken over by Modi, and what Nehru used to call fascism, which he said is the form taken by Indian communalism. Well, I mean, Modi could lose an election. He hasn't yet brought in the army or anything. It's very unlikely, I think, that he will, but it's not in a good state with massive attacks on minorities, Muslims punished, Muslims discriminated against in every field, including cricket, which the Indian population loves. That's the state of India, a fairly conformist press in a country which once used to boast of amongst the freest presses in Asia, and where there was, enormous criticism of the government in the earliest days after independence and carried on for ages. That too has now come to a standstill. People are scared. If we speak, we might lose our jobs. Not that we'll be killed, but we might lose our jobs, all our privilege. So it's a strange atmosphere in what they call the world's largest democracy. Very strange atmosphere, not at all pleasant. Bangladesh, we've just seen what's happened. I mean, a real authoritarian government brought down by student uprisings. The big difference with the early 70s is that the students had no real plan of action, no real political plan, except to get rid of her. So the minute they did that, the army became active behind the scenes and got this banker Yunus, who's, quite an aged guy, but because he's internationally known, he hasn't a clue how to run the So effectively what's happening is that the army is running the country behind the scenes. And some of I was very opposed to this government in Bangladesh, but I'm not in favor of the way in which their militants and supporters are being treated by the new government. Punishment. Where will that get them? People change, people learn lessons. It happens all over the world. So the assault on the Awami League activists and people who supported them, I think, is really reprehensible. What you have had in Bangladesh from the very beginning, I've written this somewhere or the other, is two alternative currents of opinion, thought, culture. One is 47, that's the first formation, Muslim nationalism, Bengali Muslim nationalism, which finally was crushed by the Islamic Republic of Pakistan. And that brought about a Bengali secular nationalism led by Mujibur Rahman. The Awami League has dominated it and its rivals. But now I think that tradition is also under serious challenge. So what will emerge in Bangladesh, who knows? It's a bit difficult to predict. What is clear is that the army will be in power, as in Pakistan, but from behind the scenes. And, Sri Lanka, I don't have to talk about it. It's calmed down now, but at the cost, tremendous cost, and the spilling of blood. I would hate to be a Tamil citizen of Sri Lanka at the moment. That stain, there will have to be extra action to try and wipe that stain out. So it's not the case that any part of South Asia offers, to my mind, any hope at the moment for its people. And why there aren't more rebellions is because people feel there's no one really offering an alternative. Now Imran is in prison, his party people are being locked up, mistreated. Not so much because he offers an alternative, social alternative, but because he's popular as a person. The Americans, it's now very obvious, influenced the army in getting him removed. People hate that because it's been so much part of the history of Pakistan. And that's, well-meaning young leftists in Pakistan don't want to admit this because they think admitting this is saying Imran is an anti-imperialist. This level of thought is just, it's pathetic, really. It doesn't matter what Imran is. The question is who had him removed and why. Because he was making the wrong noises on Ukraine, on Afghanistan, and more lately on Palestine. If there were an election in Pakistan today, Imran would win. In a free and fair election, his party would win. Would they do anything? No. Would the corruption carry on? Yes. Is Imran's wife corrupt? And was she taking bribes from the richest men in Pakistan? Yes. But still he's popular. Because people feel the other parties are even worse. So you take the lesser evil. That's the politics of large parts of the world today.
Another major subject you bring up in the memoir is how serious debate and openness have disappeared from mainstream political life. If I may quote a line, you write that the extreme right is small, the extreme left barely exists. It is the extreme center that dominates. End quote. After 9/11, quite a few of your old friends became new versions of what you call empire loyalists. Tell us about the conversions of those who were once intensely involved in left-wing activities. Why do you think the liberal conscience of the West is blind to the suffering of the global South?
Well, the West went that way because despite the warnings of very intelligent analysts, American, US analysts, Chalmers Johnson in particular, who wrote a book called Blowback, and warned the United States that all your adventures abroad, you will suffer one day when they come back to haunt you in this country. And this book was completely ignored when it was first published in 2000. It didn't sell many copies. Come 9/11 in Chalmers' book. He was a former CIA consultant himself and a serious academic of China and Japan. His book became a bestseller, quoted by everyone. So we used to laugh when we met together, saying this is what history can do to help the sales of a book otherwise ignored. My friends, Salman Rushdie, Christopher Hitchens, turned in the other direction. They became, to a certain degree, liberal neocons. And, it happens. You lose friends. Politics changes globally. Some of your friends hop on the bandwagon of the other side and think they're on the same side as history. Happens all over the world, not just to my friends, but a whole layer of the global intelligentsia went in that direction. I mean, I've used to have friends in India who are now BJP activists, or not activists, but ideologues, just went completely. Were Marxists once upon a time. I was thinking in particular of Schwab, I forget his second name now. A very good, very intelligent guy, now a BJP apologist. And there are many others as well in different parts of the world. The French intelligence here underwent the most rapid change I've witnessed. Why? Because one reason is it came in many parts of the world with the total collapse of the communist world. The collapse of the two largest working class parties, the French and Italian communist parties, was a huge blow. These were not just parties, they were hegemonic instruments. They had daily papers, they had weekly papers, they had cultural magazines. They intervened on many different levels. One day they were there, the second day they were gone. Swept away with the wind like cotton. That's the effect that changes in history can have. It's not new. Happened after the English Revolution of the 17th century collapsed and the monarchy was restored. It happened after the French Revolution was defeated finally in 1815. So it's happened, in Russia, and the impact of that globally we can see. So it's not a surprise that a handful of my friends, sadly, went in the same direction. And of course, you lose touch with them. But my friendship cupboard isn't totally empty. Quite a lot of my friends, well, apart from those who died, are still there. And many of them who I write about never reneged.
Earlier, you mentioned poetry, and I wanted to come back to that. You write about the relationship between language and power, and a subject near to your heart, poetry. You give a powerful example of the Syrian poet Nizar Qabbani's poem written after 1967. Every taxi driver, every tea cafe knew the words. Qabbani was banned, but his work lived on. It went from country to country and crossed borders. So tell us about how poetry has affected the Arab world, South Asia, and also your own activism.
Well, it's affected it completely. I mean, when we were kids, we used to go to mushairas, public poetry readings. I went with friends, I went with my parents, I went with others. And it was a experience I will never live again, because they don't have them now. You have videos, you can listen to all these poems, which is wonderful. You can listen to Faz, you can listen to Nazim Hikmet, you can listen to Pablo Neruda, all the great poets of the 20th century for me, just by pressing a Google button and you get a YouTube rendering of that poem. So that tradition has not been completely wiped out. Lots of young people listen to them. I mean, Faz is well known precisely because of that. I used to see them live in many cases in different parts of the world. Once I did a speaking tour of Pakistan in '69, and Habib Jadab, the very great popular poet, the people's poet, participated in the huge anti-dictatorship movement. He was with me. I would give a speech, he would recite a poem, or he would recite a poem and I would give a speech. And suddenly we did so many cities in the country like that, that I would start my speech in Urdu and start using his poetry. And he, before reciting his poetry, would take something from my speech because we got so used to each other over the weeks we traveled. And so, it was part of my life. I don't regard it as anything odd. And it had a huge impact on me and still does. When I read Nizar Kabani's poems today in the United States or Britain, there's total silence. I read the English translations, obviously. Total silence. And even people who are not that interested in poetry are just amazed that this sort of poetry is being written, as with some of the Palestinian poets who wrote their last poems and then died, were wiped out by the Israelis in this genocide that is currently taking place. So that tradition in Arab poetry never changed in Pakistan. I always tell the story of the great Lahore poet Ustad Daman, who after the first martial law was imposed in 1958, there was a poetry reading, and we went a year or so later as students, and Ustad Daman came to recite, and he was reciting his apolitical poems, also very witty and funny. And I shouted, "Kuch dekho, please say something." And then other students took up that chant, "Please say something." And he then recited an extempore poem in Punjabi, that was his language, which became actually the poem we all used to quote under every military dictatorship. It went like this: Hun ho gayiyan maujain maujan, jiddar takko faujain faujan. Now each day is sweet and balmy, wherever you look, the army. So that was poetry. And of course, I read much else besides from different parts of the world. But yeah, it played a big part in my life, and it still does. There are friends who hear me reciting poetry now and say, "Please record it. We don't want to lose your voice recording this poetry. It'll go when you die, so just record it." I haven't done so as yet. I might well do a recording of my favorite poems.
Tariq, let's talk about subcontinental cricket. You write about the nostalgia of the Indian team arriving in Lahore in the 50s. For your parents' generation, it was a small temporary reversal of partition. You write that the history of cricket is the history of the former colonies overtaking the imperial masters. Echoing the historian C.L.R. James, one way of undermining the colonists was to beat them at their favorite game. But while cricket has become increasingly international, it is still haunted by the imperial past, as well as racism, corruption, and prejudice. So, what do you think? Is it really the end of cricket?
Well, I have to say, from early childhood, I've loved cricket. I played it as a schoolboy. I know it. As I grew older, it was nice to know that other people on the left also liked it. C.L.R. James, for instance, wrote his famous book, Beyond the Boundary. Mike Marquesi, an American friend of mine who died tragically young, wrote a book called Anyone But England. And so, I've always been interested Lately, cricket has taken a globalized form, which is 2020, which I don't regard as cricket but as entertainment. It's a match finishes early, you bet on it, you bet on the players bet on each other, the big bookies manipulate the bets. It's been going on for ages. There's a very interesting series in India. What was it called? Done by Indian television, Inside Edge, was it, or something like that? Two series, absolutely excellent, mapping out what really happens behind the scenes in 2020 cricket. Seemed pretty accurate to me. Very corrupt, and very famous names involved in this corruption. And it's not just South Asia; it covers the globe. South Asians as often become adepts in all this stuff, as if we have a natural ability to manipulate and orchestrate corruption in as careful a way as possible. I was shocked when I was told by a cricket correspondent that the most corrupt cricketer in South Asia was a Sri Lankan, whose name I won't reveal because he might sue you out of existence, and said very respected, very intelligent, but has made more money than any other cricketer. So Sri Lanka gets the gold medal for that, according to my information and friends. And that does ruin it. I don't watch T20 cricket that often. I watch one-day cricket, and I still love Test. And if they're not careful, Test cricket, because not too much money is involved in that, or even betting, could be wiped out in the years to come, which would be a huge, huge tragedy. But cricket, like everything else, is being affected or infected by big money. So what that's done is created the IPL in India, or acted as the foundations of the IPL in India, which can buy almost any cricketer from any part of the world. Their auctions, annual auctions, are a bit like slave markets, except that they pay, whereas the slaves look up.
Tariq, thank you for the brilliant conversation and for taking the time to speak with us today. It was an honor to have you on the podcast, and congratulations again on the new memoir.
Thank you very much. Very nice talking to you, and best of luck to all.
Thank you for listening to the Southasia Review of Books podcast from Himal Southasian. This episode was edited by Ritika Chauhan. If you like this episode, please share widely, rate, review, subscribe, and download the show on your favorite podcast apps. You can find the links to subscribe and listen to previous episodes on our website at himalmag.com. And while you're at it, please do also check out Himal's State of South Asia podcast hosted by Associate Editor Nayanthara Narayanan, featuring conversations on pressing social and political issues from across South Asia. What we do and what we love doing at Himal is really looking at South Asian literature like no other. And that gives us a very unique community, viewpoint, and the privilege of making conversations like this possible. So if you'd like to help us out, please do become a paying Himal patron. We have a great program with lots of perks, including Himal's iconic Right Side Up map, and we'll welcome you to a fantastic Southasia Review of Books community. Thanks again, and until next time.